our next speakers who will be in conversation. It's something Federico Campagna encouraged us last year when we worked with him on the philosophy panel, and he felt that it would be interesting that we create new dialogues in the marathon, that sort of new sparks emerge. So we are very, very delighted to have here a conversation between Adam Greenfield and Aimee Meredith Cox, who will then also be later presenting a talk this afternoon. Adam is the author of Everywhere, The Drawing Age of Ubiquitous Computing, which was brought to our attention by Bruce Sterling, who told us when he came out that it's a groundbreaking book, and indeed it is, against the smart city. And more recently, he's actually preparing a book called The City is Here for You to Use, and that's forthcoming from Verso in 2016. Greenfield was the 2014 Senior Urban Fellow at the London School of Economics. Aimee Meredith Cox is a cultural anthropologist and also a movement artist who teaches at Fordham University. She's the author of Shapeshifters, extraordinary book, Black Girls and the Choreography of Citizenship, and also a forthcoming new volume called Gender and Space. She has written peer-reviewed articles in many, many magazines, and is a former professional dancer. She's the founder of Black Light, and as well also produced many community-based projects in Detroit, in New York, and also in New York City. I also wanted to mention the booklet, because as always with the Serpentine Marathons, we produce a booklet. It's always also a design experiment, so we're incredibly thankful to Folder for doing the graphic design for this book. And in the booklet you will find text by different participants, you find the program, and there is a text by Aimee specially written for this booklet. So please join me in giving a very, very warm welcome to Adam Greenfield and Aimee Meredith Cox.
Hello.
Hello.
Thanks for having us here. Aimee, it's a tremendous honor to be here on stage with you. I'm super interested in the book that you've just written, which is called Shapeshifters. Could you tell me a little bit about what that book is about, who it's about, and specifically why the title Shapeshifters?
Right, thank you. So, Shapeshifters, and the subtitle is Black Girls in the Choreography of Citizenship, is based on nearly 10 years of fieldwork, ethnographic fieldwork in Detroit, in a homeless shelter specifically for girls in Detroit. And initially, I was drawn to the shelter as a space where I might consider the relationship between devalued bodies, devalued people, how certain people are forced to navigate social systems and social institutions, and what that might say about how we think about the nature of citizenship, particularly in the United States. And so if we think about Detroit as this devalued, right, deindustrialized, racialized as black city space, and within that, the context of that city space, a homeless shelter, right, and a homeless shelter for young people. And not just for young people, but for girls.
Yeah.
And so what happened is I started to see these concentric circles of sort of marginalization, or concentric circles of how far can we get from a normative center.
Yes.
If we define a normative center as white, wealthy, and proximity to capital and wealth, if we think about Detroit, if we think about a homeless shelter, if we think about black girls, then we're nesting the ways that we actually don't think about citizenship in our country. So I was very much interested in these young women who were primarily between the ages of 15 and 22, who are homeless, not attached to the foster care system or the juvenile justice system, but homeless. And how these young women defined things that we take for granted, like love and care, protection, success, within the space of these institutions primarily meant to reform and remake and transform them.
Can you tell me why the title Shapeshifters? Because that seems like it has some pretty interesting implications.
Yeah, I mean, I struggled with the title Shapeshifters for one really basic, important reason, is that it's so deeply, profoundly connected to science fiction. And what I didn't want to do is give the impression that these young women are somehow superhuman or subhuman. I didn't want to romanticize them or devalue them as somehow not a part of the human family using shapeshifters. But the more I thought about how they brilliantly transform all of these spaces meant to reshape them. And so if you think about shapeshifters, we primarily think about shapeshifters as people or individuals or beings that change their bodies, right? Remake themselves. The most popular version of that would be transforming from a human to a animal species, right? But what I found so compelling about the lives of these young women is that they were less concerned with transforming themselves, even though that was the mandate through every institution that they were a part of. In the school system, in job training programs, in the social service agency, the homeless shelter that they were a part of, the primary mandate was how they could improve themselves, how they could become better, more productive citizens. And these young women changed the structure and the fundamental ideology of those institutions. So rather than enacting a transformation of the self, which is never really what any of this is about, what we're talking about when we talk about power and capital and exploitation, but force these institutions to change. So by the nature of their bodies in these spaces, the foundation of those spaces were transformed.
So let me tell you a couple of reasons why your work is so interesting to me. I mean, there are many, many reasons. One of them is I come from a background in information technology, and I spend a lot of my time talking about highly technologized urban spaces. So the deployment of networked information technology in cities in a way that colonizes everyday life. And if there is, as you say, within the center of the center of the center of the concentric circles that you set up, the women that you're speaking about and whose experiences you're relating, if there is a human person that is never seen, that is never discussed, whose needs are never engaged, who's never even depicted in the renderings of the heavily technologized city, it is those people and their experiences. What concerns me is that people who move through urban spaces now, very much including Detroit, as it's become a very rapid focus of interest in the re-technologizing of a depleted and depopulated and de-invested city. What concerns me is whether they have the wherewithal to move within these technologized spaces and speak their own experiences, speak their own lives, when everything is arrayed against them. I do not want to assume that people, even working within those kind of multiple deprivations, are not savvy about technology. I'm entirely certain that they are able to operate and make use of information technology in their everyday lives. Is there a digital divide? Are they detached from the knowledge of and ability to work fluently with the systems that now do so much to order everyday life in the contemporary city?
That's a question.
That's a question.
Yeah, I mean, so what struck me, and I hope I'm answering the question, but I want to, and I think this will connect with you. When I was reading the introduction to Smart Cities, against Smart Cities, what I kept thinking about was the way you talk about cities without citizens, and the way you talk about technology as perhaps not a way for us to connect. And I think about the way that the young women in Detroit. Thank you. Is this better? I think about the ways the young women in Detroit are so deeply connected and invested in community, even though these same communities have virtually failed them, right? They're homeless. They're young women who are homeless.
That's right.
But even under these circumstances, they find ways, and this is not just superfluous, like, by the way, this is the foundation of how they understand the world to work, is through interconnectedness and is through community. And so if we think about technology as a new space, right, to make those connections virtually or to make those connections happen more efficiently, I would say that these young women are very much a part of that. What does concern me, however, is the impetus in a lot of cities, not just Detroit, New York, London, the impetus to recreate, once we leave our homes, to recreate those sorts of privileged, cocooned environments that we experience online and through network experiences in our homes. So we leave our homes expecting that, or hoping that we can recreate those same feelings of safety, protection, and comfort that are really all about who we exclude.
Yeah.
And so what I'm troubled by when I think about technology and I think about the amazing possibilities, right? The amazing possibilities for people to have access to information, for people to take care of themselves more quickly, for people to understand how the world works in a rapid-fire way. I also think about what's lost in the sense of community, where we are actually charged with taking care of one another.
That's something that concerns me massively, that the notion of mutual aid, which so many of us subsist on, is something that's almost, again, entirely absent from the smart city discourse. The cities that are being prepared for us, I feel, in the 21st century are predicated on some models of personhood, some models of community, some models of what it means to be a citizen in urban space that, again, kind of break down at their boundaries. They don't necessarily apply even to me. For example, we talk about citizens. We talk about, smart citizens. That's become kind of the term du jour, the term of art that's actually emerged in preference to the smart city. And people think that there's something kind of recuperative about this, that the smart citizen is a preferable discourse to the smart city. Well, as it happens, I'm not a citizen of this city, right? I'm very sensitive about that word citizen. I'm a Londoner, I like to believe, and in fact, I'm invested with all my heart in being a Londoner, but I'm not a citizen. And what concerns me so much is that the models that wound up getting literally hardwired into things that are at very deep levels of infrastructure, that model a person and their ability to interact with things, whether they have access to banking services or not, whether they have access to a roof over their head or not. All of these things are generated by people who, if you'll forgive me, tend not to be very reflective about their own privileges and tend, therefore, not to see them. I worry massively about, in fact, the majority of people in the world that wind up falling outside of the categories and the orderings and the models for whom the smart city is being prepared. What do you think we can do about that?
I knew that was coming, right? I think you answered part of your question in framing the question. I think what is the most difficult thing for most of us to do is to self-reflect. Yeah. And not just to be self-reflective, but to be self-reflexive, which implies a sort of action based on that reflecting. It's very difficult to not only locate yourself in the world, to be very honest about that location in the world, but to, in addition to that, be honest about what that means in terms of how you are accountable to other people. The more privilege you have, the more resources you have, the easier it is not to have that sense of connectedness. And so you can rely on things, you can rely on inanimate objects in many ways to create community for you, to take care of your business in ways that people who aren't interfaced in that way can't. I firmly believe that change has to happen, and this sounds really like kumbaya-ish and corny, but it is really actually true, right? If we think about any cliche, there's a kernel of truth there. There's something that's very truthful that we like to deny, but change has to happen with that initial space of self-reflection and that initial willingness to do something to create more access for someone other than yourself. This is not an easy proposition. This is something that is not comfortable for most of us. And I'm also, when I talk about privilege, we talk about privilege and power. We use these words a lot. It's for me too. I mean, we all have to figure out the ways that we are connected to power and privilege and what that means for how we allow more folks to live more life-affirming lives. I also think that the way that education happens in a lot of large urban spaces is not conducive to this sort of digital technology divide. And so you can walk into, for example, schools in Detroit, schools in Newark, New Jersey, and see rooms larger than this room that are filled with brand new computers, brand new Mac computers that are outfitted with the latest technology. But there's a difference between having access to the material product and actually having the skill or the know-how to make that material product work for you.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah.
And so the solution has been in a lot of public school systems to just put technology in the schools, just to place them, like literally hardwire them to the walls without thinking about how that technology can be used in the best possible way in that local environment. And that takes research, that takes really actually talking to people and understanding what's happening in their lives. That is a much bigger step than finding the funding to actually put computers into schools and just drop them down there. They might as well not be there, right? So
Well, I think that in a sense the challenge is even richer and deeper than that. I mean, I think that we may actually have finally gotten it through some people's heads that you can't just drop a classroom full of Macs in. I hope anyway that people now understand that. The response to that I've seen typically is, well, we're going to have an open hackathon, and this language is we're going to have a hack day, a maker space, and I'm curious if that language has any resonance or would have any resonance for the women that you write about, if they would feel themselves at all welcomed in a space like that, or if they would think that hacking is a thing that appeals to them or that they would find empowering.
no, not at all. I mean, I think there's also girls who code, right? So
Yeah,
there's
sure.
all these coding networks and ways to think about how technology might actually work for populations that aren't typically seen as being connected to digital technology. I don't think any of it connects,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah.
don't think it's, and I don't mean not, when I say connect, I don't mean, of course, people understand what it means and they get how it can be used, but in terms of connecting in the sense that I think you're talking about, which is how do people actually take something and apply it to their lives in a way that is meaningful and useful,
Yeah.
then I would say no, right?
Yeah.
Then in that sense, there is no, the connection does not exist.
That's exactly what concerns me. I feel like there's a lot of work to be done. I mean, there's this rhetoric of openness, there's the rhetoric of open systems and of free software, but actually connecting that to people's concerns and the language they use to represent themselves and their conception of self, it seems that there's quite a lot of distance to me that needs to be covered. I want to circle back a little bit and talk about accountability. I'm really glad you raised that, and about privilege, because both you and I sit on this stage as published authors, as people who have created these objects. They're out there in the world. They do work in the world. What kind of work do you expect Shapeshifters to do, and how would you begin to measure its success?
So just as a point of information that I think is really important, my book just came out in August, right? And so I feel like I actually had a baby, like a 10-year-old baby.
No postpartum
finally
depression,
born.
I hope.
Yeah, all of
Yeah,
that,
okay.
all of that. And so what I'm finding is that the life of the book begins when people read it, obviously, right? And so a few days ago, I had my first conversation with a group of graduate students at Rutgers University who had read the book and who were in conversation with me about the book. And what they pulled from the book, what they thought was meaningful, what they were able to situate in relationship to other things that they read, into relationship to their own lives, some of that never even occurred to me in the writing of the book, or even in the rereading and continuing to talk about it. And so for any book, I think one of the primary goals has to be not that that book is perfect, not that it answers every question, but it has got to be the beginning of a deeply honest conversation. And so what is most exciting to me now about the book being published is not that it's done, right, and I can move on, but that it really is just the beginning of thinking about these ideas. So the way that I talk about citizenship, the way that I write about the texture of these girls' lives in that moment has changed now, and it changes with every reader and with every response that every reader gives to me. So the ideas that I think are so deeply important, the way that we talk about who matters in the human family, the way that we think about responsibility and accountability, when I changed from the time that I did the research, from the time the book was published, to every single person who has a conversation with me about the book. So I think regardless, so you're writing about cities, right? Cities and smart cities, and what we think about the 21st or even 22nd century city and where we all fit into that. I'm writing about Black girls in Detroit, but it's so much bigger than that. Both of those books are so much bigger than that initial entree into thinking about, broadly speaking, what does it mean to be human?
Yeah.
And so I think with any book, regardless of the title, regardless of the content, the goal is for it to have a continual revitalized life in the conversations that happen around it, with the hope that those conversations lead us to some solutions to the questions that we pose in the book, that we pose in the text.
I hope you find that to be the case. Aimee Meredith Cox, it's been a pleasure and a privilege
It's been a
speaking with you
pleasure.
this afternoon. Thank you
Thank
very much
you.
for your time and your thoughts.